Hello, Happy Valley. Today's video is all about the principles of design. So in Visual Art 1, you learned about the 7 elements of art, which I call the ingredients. The principles of design are the recipe in which you use those ingredients to create a harmonious work of art. Without further ado, let's get started. Before we start talking about the principles of design, I want to go back and do a small refresher on the elements of art. If you need more information on the elements, please X out of this video and go back and watch the 7 elements of art video. So the 7 elements of art are the basic building blocks or the ingredients to art. Line, shape, form, space, value, color, and texture. If you remember these elements, they play a role in a piece of artwork. Not all of the ingredients are represented in a piece of artwork. Usually there's 2, 3, maybe even 4 at tops that will play a role in a piece of art. Space is that one element of art that is always there. It is a constant. It's one that will never be missing from the ingredients. So the principles of design, they are the recipe. That's how you use those ingredients, the elements, to make a work of art. There are 8, and it really depends on who is teaching or what's being taught. You will notice if you ever do any kind of research on them that they transition, they change, they've been added to. And so this is the 8 that I have chosen. And I will explain as I go how things can differentiate. So our first is balance, and this is the distribution of visual weight. When we talk about weight in art, generally we're talking about visual weight. So you have this feeling of balance. As a result, there are several different ways that you can look at balance. There's symmetrical balance where things are matched on either side. It's as if you took a piece of paper, folded it in half, and it matches on either side of that crease. And then you have asymmetrical balance, and this is where they don't quite match up. And lastly, which I don't have an example of, there is radial balance, where things are working in a circle. They are radiating out from a single point. So here's some examples of symmetrical balance. You have the trees mirroring each other on either side. It's as if you could simply fold all of these pictures literally in half and you would have an equal image on both sides of the paper. The butterfly is a perfect example of symmetrical balance. The building, you have symmetrical balance on that as well. And then the book. So the image at the top, this is a painting by Edward Hopper, and it's called Nighthawks. What's going on is that you have a lot of visual weight over on the right-hand side. You also have this light that's also bringing your eye to that direction. But if you look at the building itself, it is dominating the right-hand side of this image. Then to the bottom left, you have this paper cutout. You have this gigantic circle that is dominating the majority of the composition. And lastly, you have the illustration of the waves. That wave on the left-hand side is over-dominating the composition. So when you're working with the principle of design balance, there's many things that you can talk about. The visual weight, is it more symmetrical? Is it asymmetrical? Is it radial? Our second principle of design, contrast. So contrast is talking about the juxtaposition. This is a very big word. It just means opposite. So the juxtaposition of different elements of art in order to highlight their differences or create visual interest. So things that are contrasting on the image, you have black and white, dark and light. You could have rough or smooth textures. So things that are opposite, things that are really dark in value versus things that are very light in value are going to cause contrast, and it's going to become a interest. The contrast of dark and light values makes for a dramatic effect. So we have Edward Hopper here down in the left-hand corner. Again, we have this visual balance we talked about earlier, but we also have this contrast between the darkness outside and the light being eliminated from the inside that building. So we have this sharpness, this contrast. So not only are our eyes pulled over to the right hand side of the image, but it's not just because of the balance, but it's also because of the contrast. So you can have more than one principle of design in an artwork, and you can, we can stretch things and say that we could pull something from every image, but there are certain principles that dominate that image. For me, the Edward Hopper painting, I feel like the contrast is more dominating than the visual balance. But then again, somebody else might perceive it otherwise. It's not to say either one is right or wrong, but these principles and these elements of art, there is a little bit of fluidity in between them. If you look over in the top left-hand corner, this is a painting by Henri Toulouse-Lautrec. He was a French painter. And this is actually from inside the Moulin Rouge, which is in Paris. And it was kind of a upper class, or I don't know, not even upper class, but a dance hall. Ladies of the night would work here. So you have this contrast again of the green lights, the stage lights, if you would, the lighting in the room versus the darkness of the outfits that people are wearing. So you have this contrast, especially when you look over on the right-hand side of the painting, the woman's face, you have this really, dramatic lighting, dramatic effect that you get from the contrast from her face to her clothing. The painting over on the right-hand side is by Norman Rockwell, and the contrast is really the figure in the middle. So you have this background, this black background, maybe it's a chalkboard, and then you have this gentleman standing right in front of it. There is a contrast in the background and the man's face, the background and the man's clothing that creates this dramatic effect. Our third principle of design is emphasis. Notice how I'm emphasizing the word. So when an element or combination of elements dominate a composition, that's emphasis. Emphasis is talking about a focal point or a center of interest, something that is different than the rest, that is pulling your eye right to it. So this image on the screen, you have that one red circle. Everything else is black and white. So your eye automatically goes towards that focal point. When you look at this painting, what is your eye drawn to first? Now for me, I am drawn to the figure over here on the bottom left-hand side. That is what's being emphasized. But then I soon look over to the house. So I have a hard time exactly figuring out which one I'm drawn to first. Is it the female in the figure, or the figure in the bottom left-hand corner, or is it the house up at the top right-hand side? My answer is it's the female. The female is what is first grabbing my interest. That is what I feel is emphasized in this painting. Not only is she in the foreground, but there is this contrast in her hair versus the background. So it's also a bit of a focal point for me. Now the reason why your eye travels then to the building is because she's looking at it. Although we can't see her face, we too are humans. And when we see another human looking at something, we tend to look in that direction. It's a subconscious thing. So you have this bouncing, this interest or this emphasis, right, in multiple areas. And what's really interesting is this triangulation. This is something that was kind of developed during the Renaissance. Things are in sets of 3. So a lot of the times when you look at paintings, you'll see things that are triangulated. So we have this figure in the bottom left hand, then she's looking up at the house on the right hand side, then you're taken over to, I'm assuming like a little barn or shack over on the left, and back on down to that female. So we create this triangulation, so this emphasizing in different areas. This painting by Vincent van Gogh. Things are being emphasized. Your eye is drawn over generally to the right-hand side, over towards the corner of the bed. The bed is kind of dominating. We have this asymmetrical balance. So we have that bed over on the right-hand side. So you're already kind of drawn to the weight, the visual weight. And then everything kind of comes to that corner. So you have this visual balance, and then it's dragging you towards that right-hand side top corner. The spacing, the placement of objects, all going towards that right-hand corner are going to attract your attention. So that's that emphasizing. In this painting, what is the thing that you're drawn to first? It's that little birdhouse in the boy's hand. Why? Well, first off, everybody's looking at it. So again, there's that subconscious human characteristic where we will tend to look at what other human beings are looking at. But that's not the only thing. We have a set of 3. So we have the 2 boys in what looks like Boy Scouts, the younger Boy Scouts ensembles, and then we have the older Boy Scout holding the birdhouse. Again, we have this triangulation. I tend to look over on the right-hand side, then I move up to the older boy and back down to the younger boy and back around. So we have this interest. Everybody's looking at this one object. That is what you're drawn to. Again, you also have a bit of a contrast, you could say here, between the darkness of the young boy's ensemble, and then we also have the birdhouse in his hands. So there's a bit of color in this that is kind of, or value more than color, but we have this sense of contrast. So now can you see how these principles of design can really be stretched, and we can say that each painting has a different or multiple principles, and we can, but there are ones that are more dominating than others. And for this one, emphasis is that one, because what is you drawn to? That one focal point right there in their hands. Pattern. Pattern is an arrangement of the elements, a repetition of these elements, lines, shapes, colors. They create a motif or a theme. Now, patterns are generally symmetrical. They have, a repeated element over and over and over again. So generally, you're going to get symmetry in a pattern. Doesn't mean that it can't change. Pattern is a really fun element, and that really brings in texture. Patterns and texture, they tend to go hand in hand, an element and a principle. There is a repetition to this. This is by Jackson Pollock, and you could say that this looks like chaos, and sometimes I do. I'm not the biggest fan of it, but there is a pattern to this, a repetition of those elements. Lines, color, the pattern, black and white, creating repetition. And pattern is also a really good one for Gustav Klimt. He's the one that does The Kiss, and I wish I'd had that up here for you guys to see, but he creates a lot of pattern in his textiles or the clothing he creates. He does that with repeated elements. Generally, he'll do he has done a more boxy shape for men and a more curvilinear shape for women, because men are more linear, women are more curvilinear. But pattern is a really fun principle. It's, it could be more of an element. You see it quite often, but pattern can bring interest and emphasize areas. Andy Warhol, the pop artist, he was, repetition. And that's why sometimes you'll see the word repetition as a principle. It's pattern. They're the same thing. They pretty much go hand in hand. So that's why I've kind of eliminated the two and I've kept it down to pattern. But he keeps this repetition in his artworks. So he would, do a lot of pop cultural items, the Campbell soup cans, the Coca-Cola bottles, and then he's done the Marilyn Monroes. There's several things that he has taken from pop culture and created into, moved into the art movement. But we have this repetition of elements, repetitions of colors, just it's fun. Pattern is a fun principle of design to work with. Never mind. Here he is. So Gustav Klimt, I was just talking about him. I should have looked ahead, Miss Sesses. But you can see here, the bottom left-hand side, there's the kiss that I was talking about. And he has more linear shapes for the male, more curvilinear for the female. But he creates this texture or this pattern in all of his artworks for the textiles, for the clothing. Scale. And sometimes you'll see proportion, but proportion and scale go hand in hand again. So scale is just talking about the relationship between objects with respect to their number, their size, and so on. So you can play with proportions. You can over-exaggerate or understate or play, these things, they play a vital role with scale. Can you think of a local restaurant that plays with scale? Think of the outside of a building. If you're talking about the Powell's building, you've got it. So this is a great example of playing with proportions. We have exaggerated, we have overstated the size of those objects, and it creates interest, it creates excitement, and there's several things like that. And then you can also you could scale down. And so we have over here in the top left-hand side where they've taken little tiny figurines and they've taken a cigarette butt, which is very small in comparison, and they've made it look as if it's a giant sculpture because they have made the scale of the humans very small, brought them down to maybe the size of an ant. The bottom left-hand side, that is the giant eyeball that is in, I believe, Dallas or Fort Worth, Texas. I think it's Dallas. Again, we are playing with scale, unless that's the eyeball of some kind of Goliath. But again, we can play with this scale, and it can be quite fun. It can be exciting to see, and you see it a lot in sculpture. So a lot of this is more for sculpture. You can still play with proportions and things like that, obviously, in paintings, but it's just, it comes off more fun when you're talking about three-dimensional artworks. And then again, the bottom right-hand side, they've created this massive clothespin by working with natural elements in the outside world. So I find that it's fun to see. And here's Ron Munich. He plays with scale by creating gigantic people. It's almost grotesque to see just this over exaggeration and playing with proportions. Then you have rhythm. Rhythm and movement. Sometimes, again, you'll see a principle labeled as movement. And they really go hand in hand because rhythm is creating a repetition of elements that are directing us in a movement. They are causing our eyes to go through that artwork, to follow the line, follow the yellow brick road. So there's ways that we can describe movements or rhythms. Think of rhythm as in playing a beat, playing music. You're following that cadence, that rhythm. And that can be the same thing in artwork, except now it's visual rhythm. All right, you're moving through that artwork. And again, there are 4 different types of rhythm that we can discuss. Implied movement. So again, we're implying, or we're suggesting that something is moving when in fact it's static, meaning it's frozen. Okay. This sculpture is a great example of it. It looks as if he's moving through wind. And we get that by the curvilinear shapes that are going behind him. He has this stance, this human stance, as if he's trying to forcefully go forward. But he's not. He's frozen. So again, it's implication. It's implying that he is going forward. Just like when we look at implied lines in Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night, there's the implication of wind. There's movement in that when there really isn't anything. Then you have sequential movement, thinking of things that are working in a sequence. A great example of this is a comic strip. Things are going from one step to the other. There's a story here. Okay, there's a narrative. Photography. Nowadays, we could create a whole sequential movement, because when we take photographs, if you hold that button down, it'll take multiple photographs in split seconds. Right? So we're telling a story. We have a series of images that are being arranged to tell a story, or they're working towards. A flip book is a perfect example of sequential movement. You have optical movement, using your eye. And this is Bridget Riley. She was a pop artist, or I'm sorry, an op artist. So she used a lot of repeated lines, a lot of repeated shapes. And it actually, what happens is it tires your retina in your eyes when you look at it, when you stare at it for a while. And it's going to provoke it to create an optical illusion. So if you ever stared at, maybe wallpaper for a really long time, or something that's striped and the lines start to move. So that's an example of your retina getting exhausted, and you're actually, things are blurring and creating this illusion of movement when in fact really nothing is. And then you have kinesthetic movement, or actual movement, something that is actually moving. So there's motion in it. These images, the things that are moving that are white, they're actually on a record player. So as the record player moves, it moves opposite of that record player, and it creates this really visual, this beautiful movement. And then the thing on the right-hand side is moved by natural elements. The wind is moving that. This is something that's positioned outside. So sometimes it might speed up, sometimes it goes slow, sometimes it doesn't move at all. But this is an example of rhythm in art, actual movement. This would be the playing of a song. Our 7th principle is variety. And variety is a fun one too, in my opinion. And that's just showing differences, combinations in colors and textures and shapes and values, and pretty much a variety of elements. So here we have a ton of ingredients working with this principle of design, this recipe, right? And it provides diversity. It creates something fun. Work that shows variety is tending to be upbeat and exciting. And this is Wasyl Kandinsky. And he was also a musician, if you can't kind of see that in his artworks, especially the one over on the right-hand side. And so he has a variety of elements in his artworks. It's not just, it's colors, it's shapes, it's lines. He's got lots of texture, lots of different values being used in his artworks, and that becomes exciting. So variety is a very exciting principle to work with. And lastly, we have unity. Sometimes you'll see harmony and unity, and I combine the two. Unity is like space, okay? Space was that element of art that's just there. It's a constant. It's in every single piece of artwork. And so is unity, or it should be. Now, any piece of fine art, I'd say, unity is present. So unity is kind of like an abstract idea, and that's why it's always the last guy on the list. But it's talking about visual harmony. Is the painting cohesive? Does it make the artwork feel complete? So unity provides harmony and a wholeness. Essentially, when you're talking about unity, you need to ask, does everything in that picture, in that composition, belong? So when we look at this painting, we have harmony in the shapes. They're harmonious because we have the similarity of the cones, and we also have similarity in the ice cream itself. There are 2 scoops of ice cream on each one of these cones. Those top scoops are almost perfect. The bottom scoops are all kind of a little wonky. So we have this harmony in shapes, familiarity in the shapes, the cones, the ice cream. We also have harmony in the color because we have, for the most part, an analogous set of colors. If you remember back from Art 1, analogous meaning 3 colors next to each other on the color wheel. So we have this yellow-orange, we have the yellow, and we have the yellow-green, and then we have a neutral, more of a pinkier shade, but again, we've got this set of warm tones. Yes, I know yellow-green is more of a cool tone, but it's so similar, it's close, it's analogous. So we have this harmony between them. Now here's 2 paintings. Let's talk about these. So we already know the one on the right hand side is by Kandinsky. We just talked about him when we talked about variety. And then we have on the left hand side a color painting by Mark Rothko. Right. So both of these have unity to them. They also, have other elements of art, other principles of design. But which one are you more attracted to? If you said Kandinsky, that's because it has variety. And unity and variety are those 2 principles that are often discussed together. Because ultimately, an artwork must contain both unity and variety to be a successful work of art. And there needs to be a balance between the 2 principles. Now, if you said Rothko, this is also correct. This is a really good example of perfect harmony, of perfect unity. But being a perfect, matching that perfection isn't always interesting. Okay, so perfect harmony is not necessarily the idea here. Okay, that's like reaching the gods. You don't want to really meet that perfect unity. Okay, because it's not going to be interesting. All right, so that is the 8 principles of design.